some of these incidences. And it brings about a very interesting scenario in chapter 16. And it's the kind of scenario that if you're sitting in a room and a couple starts having a conversation like we're having here in chapter 16, you're liable to say, excuse me, I have to go do something in the other room. And you may not want to listen to it because you can tell it's probably pretty intense conversation. So, and you may feel like it's none of your business type of thing. But nonetheless, God puts it out for the whole world for us to see sometimes these scenarios, and it's interesting to look at it and see how people handle them. One thing I want to make clear right off the bat before we get into this, because sometimes you can get the wrong idea, I think, about certain biblical characters. In 1 Peter chapter 3, how does the Bible, or how does God describe the personality of Sarah? What kind of woman is she? I think that's important to keep in mind as we're studying these verses. What kind of woman was Sarah in 1 Peter chapter 3?
She obeyed her husband.
Okay, she obeyed her husband. That's something she did. What else was there indicative of her personality? I mean, was she a hothead?
She was
No.
humble person.
She was a very humble person, wasn't she?
Yeah, respectful.
She was faithful and kind. You get the feeling that she was probably easy to get along with. You could tell she loved her husband because she did some extraordinary things for him over the course of his life. So the Bible actually puts her as a pinnacle for all women to try to emulate her personality. So she's an extraordinary individual, as well as her husband Abraham too. He's an extraordinary individual, and it's not a coincidence, I think, that God picked a couple like this where both of them were extraordinary individuals. Does that mean they're perfect? Absolutely not. Nobody's perfect. So we're going to see that come out in some of these chapters too. But I think it's important we realize what kind of personality Sarah is, what kind of person she is, because you could get the wrong idea perhaps by looking at this chapter the wrong way.
Hey Jeff, the other thing it says there is, about being frightened. That's the one thing I always thought with her. She went along with him, even though they were in situations that were, for most women, those would have been terrifying situations that she went through.
Yes.
And she just went along with him because he was following God. And I think that's another point, I guess.
Yeah, for the most part, she kind of trusted him in some of his decisions, and she looked up to him, and she allowed him to lead, and she supported him in the things that he did. So that needs to be noted for happy marriages too. In this particular scenario now, in chapter 16, I'm going to read verses 1 through 5. We didn't read 4 and 5, but we're going to read those also, actually, and then we'll begin to discuss it. We talked a little bit about the first 4 verses. So, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian handmaid named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant, perhaps I can build a family through her." Abraham agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. Now when she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Do you think there's some emotion expressed, while, I read this emotionless, but do you think there was probably some emotion in her voice when she said this, particular paragraph here at the last ending? Probably. So, whose idea is this to do this? Is it Abram's idea? It's her idea, is it? And we talked last week about surrogate parents. I mean, there's surrogacy going on even in this day and age, big time. And it was going on back in those days. They couldn't use test tubes, they had to do it the old fashioned way. But nonetheless, Abram didn't just sleep with Hagar, he actually married her. So he was trying to do the moral thing, and we talked about the fact too, that back at that time, for a man to have more than one wife was not necessarily looked upon the same way it is today in our cultures of our world today. I'm not gonna try to make judgments about what God thinks about that back then, because I really, honestly, I don't know. He never says anything about it, but whatever it was, it happened, and it doesn't seem like it has the same connotation that it does today in our world, in which we live now. So she comes up with this idea of a surrogacy, because why does she want to do this surrogacy thing? What's her reasoning for it? She has a very good reason for it.
You know, A, she wants a baby, and B, she's trying to help fulfill the promise.
Yes, and what, besides the promise too, what's this gonna do for her husband?
Make him happy.
It'll make him happy, but there's another goal in mind.
Make offspring for him.
Heritage.
Make, what'd you say,
Offspring for him.
Yeah.
An heir. Mhm.
an heir?
Heritage.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest thing, because it's revealed that in another place too, Abraham was concerned that a guy named Eliezer was gonna inherit his whole estate, and that was not his son. He was a servant, he was probably a very good servant, but God said, no, he's not gonna be your heir. So Sarah, because she loves her husband, and she wants her husband to have a child that could be his heir and inherit his entire estate, agrees to go along with this. And I think it's partly out of love for Abram that she's doing this. It allows this to happen. But it's also, there's probably some other reasons too, because this child, in a surrogacy situation, whose child will this really be? Hagar's or Sarai's?
Sarah.
It'll really be Sarai's, just like in surrogacy today. If you do it today, the mother who has the baby gives up all rights to the baby and gives it to the parent that has contracted them in a legal contract to do that, and they give up the baby to the other person. So Abraham agrees to do this. We don't know whether he did it reluctantly or willingly. It doesn't tell us. It doesn't really matter, I suppose. But nonetheless, he goes along with it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what this really means later on, because there's some important things to consider in this whole scenario. Then verse 4 and 5, when she says she was pregnant, Hagar, she begins to despise her mistress. And Sarai says to Abram, you were responsible for this wrong. I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now she knows she is pregnant. She despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. So in this particular scenario right here now, why does Hagar despise Sarai? What is the reason for her attitude?
Some of this, Jeff, is, we talked about when they went into Egypt and they lied about being brothers and sisters. Some of this is coming back on them right here, because it specifically says this was an Egyptian servant that they surely picked up when they were in Egypt as part of this whole
You're right.
charade, and now it's all coming back, and that happens a lot in the Bible, where you see the family ends up paying for the sins that happened a long time earlier, somehow, and that's exactly what's happening here.
Yeah.
It doesn't really answer your question, but
Yeah, because they bring, unbelievers into the family situation. It's a very close situation. So it does create some problems, because her attitude isn't probably gonna be the same as Sarah's. So, but she's the word he uses is despise. why would she despise Sarai? Because I think there's some reasons you can look at why she might despise her. Peter.
Well, she can have children, and Sarai can't.
Yeah,
That's the base. You may be my mistress, but I can have children.
just out of curiosity, does it say they ever asked Hagar for permission to be a surrogate? They really don't ask her, do they? At least it doesn't appear to be. What is the, once she has this baby, is there a possibility she's gonna not wanna give this baby up? Is that unusual for a woman to feel that way when they carry a baby full term? In a situation like this where they don't wanna give the baby up? Yeah, they become attached. They don't wanna give them up. Also, too, at the same time, too, consider this. Do you think there's any possibility in her mind, she's been the maidservant. She's basically, in a sense, a slave to Sarai. She's her servant. She's gotta do whatever she says. Do you think there's any possibility that now Hagar is thinking, hey, I'm gonna have the baby now. I'm gonna be the number one wife. Sarai's gonna drop down in Abraham's eyes. Do you think it's possible she could have thought that?
Yep.
Is it gonna happen? From what we know of Abraham, do you think it might be foolish for Hagar to think this way?
It should. It is. And she should have realized that because she's been with them for a while now, so she should have realized that.
Yeah,
But pride makes us do stuff sometimes.
yeah, it does. So she's making a big mistake here. Does this whole scenario also too, when she blames Abraham for this whole scenario, does this remind you of another story back earlier in Genesis between a husband and wife? Where the blame game goes on?
The woman you gave me.
The woman you gave me did this to me. It's funny how human beings are consistent when they come upon guilt in our lives, but it's their fault. They're both blaming each other. Although I'm not sure Eve blamed Adam as much as Adam blamed Eve, but nonetheless, it's a scenario that is familiar to a lot of us. So let me ask you this too: is Sarai completely wrong about Abraham to be blamed for this situation? Is she completely wrong to blame Abraham for this scenario? Now, this is speculation.
Well, Abraham could have trusted God because he said, you and Sarai will have a baby. So Abraham could have taken the stand, God's got this, he doesn't need our help.
Now, up to this point, and if I've missed it, I apologize, but I tried to scour through. Up to this point, every time God spoke to Abraham about having a child, a son, to be his heir, he's always spoken just to Abram, and Sarai's name is never mentioned. Up to this point. So, if that is true, where her name was not mentioned up to this point, and if I missed it, I apologize. I couldn't find it though. I don't think her name is mentioned at this point. So if that's true, that could change the situation a little bit as far as, and I'm not sure, it doesn't have to be necessarily out of a situation of lack of faith. It could just be some other areas too, and we're gonna talk about this here in a second, but Abraham probably should have been able to figure out this situation, that he wasn't doing the right thing. I bet his conscience was probably bothering him too, but that's speculation to get to. Do you think it's possible Sarai could have not felt great about this situation too, and realized, maybe she was wrong too, and going through and pressuring Abram to do this, because it does appear she pressures him to do it. Do you think it's possible she could have known that this wasn't the right thing to do either?
Yeah, it's just that she's now, because she's in the situation, she's so soothed in her ego or anger.
Mhm.
And it's easy to say, well, you know, if you had just pushed back a little, then
Yeah.
this wouldn't have happened, but
That's it.
technically,
I'm glad you said that because that's an interesting thing too. Guys, oh boy, should I say this?
You're out, don't
Is it hard for men sometimes to resist their wives when the, when their wives are very insistent about something and very emotional about something? Does that make it difficult for the guy sometimes to put his foot down and say, if he thinks this is wrong, is it hard to do that sometimes?
I wanna see which man's gonna be brave enough to answer that.
Glad Deb's gone, you guys are okay.
I'd say,
Don't go
yeah.
there.
I'd say,
it is hard.
I'd say use a lot of men's common knowledge, common sense, to speculate on and get your problems done. I don't listen to,
Hey, how well does
The big
common sense
W.
work on women when they're
Doesn't.
emotionally upset?
Hugs.
It doesn't.
I'm gonna say it.
It's insulting.
It doesn't always work.
It doesn't work. You see,
Always. I will say never.
yeah,
Next time.
Okay, so now I got 4 scenarios here where it's possible, this is what Abraham and Sarah were thinking. And I think there's a lot of truth to some of these. First off, there's a strong possibility that Abraham and Sarah were under a misunderstanding. Because as I just said, I don't think Sarai's name was ever mentioned as being a part of having a son. Abraham was promised this, but I don't recall that Sarai was promised to be that woman that he would have that baby with. So if her name is never mentioned, is it possible Sarai could think, oh, maybe it's another woman that he was gonna put that through, and maybe that's why she came up with the idea of Hagar, cause here we go, here's another woman that could take the spot. Here's another thing too, notice too in verse 2, she said, the Lord has kept me from having children.
yeah.
What does that mean? The Lord has kept me from having children.
Yeah, I think
Closed her womb?
about this time, I think she's kind of accepted she's barren and
Yeah.
it's never gonna be different.
How many years has it been? This promise has been going on.
Didn't she in her
It's like 70 years.
Yeah, she's in her 70s now.
Yeah,
Well, I think this goes back to, it could go back to that Egyptian thing too, because what was the punishment on the
Yes.
Egyptians? They closed up their womb.
yes. So she's observed God doing that, hasn't she?
Yeah.
Where God closed up the womb of women that he was upset with their families for doing something that was wrong. She's seen that happen. She might be thinking, maybe God's that angry at me and closed my womb. It's not beyond the pale of possibility. She could have thought that. Also too, just plain old doubt in God's promises. Maybe she's thinking, that he's not gonna do it for her. And here's the last one too, this is an interesting one, science. Why would she doubt because of science? Somebody sort of already said it,
Her age.
her age. As a matter of fact, if you look over in chapter 18, verse 11, it mentions too, she was past the age of having children. In other words, it might imply menopause. So if she's already had menopause, I doubt that she would be able to be pregnant. And I think Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother, was in the same scenario too, past the age of childbearing. So in other words, at this point, I'm saying science, if Sarah's gonna have a baby now at this point, what's it gonna take? Huh?
A miracle.
It's gonna take a miracle. And it's been 70 years, no miracle, her name is not mentioned. She's seen God curse other women with not being able to have children. Is it totally beyond the realm of possibility that we might all have the same doubts in our minds if we were in the same scenario? It's a difficult spot to be in, because if you really look at it, this is a long time. How many humans would feel frustrated waiting this long? 70 years. That's a long time. So before we accuse this couple for a lack of faith, we need to consider, some of the misunderstandings that might be going through their minds at this particular time. Also too, there, as this unfolds a little bit too, let's read now, verse 6. When after she said, "May the Lord judge between you and me," Abram speaks up now. "Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Do you think he said it like I just said it? I doubt it. "She's your servant. Do whatever you want." And she was. She was her servant. You know, this was your idea. You want to fix it? Fix it. So then Sarai, it depends on which version you have here now. My version says Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. Some of your versions will say Sarah treated her harshly. Now, is there a difference between mistreated, the definition, and harshly?
Neither are kind.
Neither are kind. But what does mistreated imply towards Sarah when you use it that way? Mistreated. Does it imply Sarah might be doing something wrong versus harshly is still unkind? But I think mistreated implies a little bit that maybe Sarah is going beyond what she should be doing. Harshly means she was being mean, she was being hard, but at the same time though too, is she justified for being harsh with Hagar?
Yeah, in a sense, it's,
Jealous.
if she's harsh, then, you would look at it from the sense that technically what she was trying to do was to put Hagar in her place.
Mm-hmm.
Remember who you are. It doesn't matter that you may have a child, but hey, I got the ring.
Does Sarah,
She had a ring too.
Yeah, but my ring is bigger. My ring is bigger.
well, there's some truth to what you're saying. That's why I mentioned when we started out the class,
Why?
what kind of a woman was Sarah? Did Sarah understand her place of submission in her life?
Yes,
Yes, she
because
did.
she is commended for it
Yeah.
in the New Testament.
Yeah. So does Sarah realize when she should obey and do what somebody tells her to do, whether she likes it or not?
Yes.
She understood that. Is Hagar going along with that same scenario? It doesn't appear to be at this point. So and not only that, what is she to Sarah, or Sarai? She's her slave. Now, she's gonna run away here, and see, let's see verse 6. He said, then Sarah mistreated, so she fled from her. In that time and culture, in that day and age, what could Sarai do to Hagar for running away as a slave?
She could kill her.
Stoned.
She could kill her.
She could get stoned, right?
Even under Hebrew law, she could kill her. Under the law of Moses, she could kill her.
But we're not under the law.
No, we're not. But I'm just talking back then.
Then she could have had her killed, yeah.
Either way, probably most of the time, I doubt that they would kill him, depending on the situation. Like if they had done it many, many times and created all kinds of problems, that might be a different scenario. But more often than not, they're still a valuable person to have around. So I doubt that they would want to kill her because she's still valuable. So the fact that Sarah treats her harshly shows you a lot about Hagar and her attitude and fleeing from her because she's taken a terrible, terrible.
I think
Chance.
Sarah was mad, I mean, it was because Sarah blames Abraham, even though it's her fault, as much, probably more than anybody. She blames Abraham in verse 5, she said, "May the wrong be, that's on me, be on you." And he's like, "This isn't my problem, you're the one that started this thing." Basically what he says, and then that makes her even madder. and then she takes it out on Hagar. I mean, you can see it all playing out. It's new human nature. I mean,
Yeah.
that happens a million times a day all over the world.
Yeah,
Yeah, a lot.
But,
good thing Deb's in Europe.
Oh, I'm recording it for you. She texted me this morning.
Sarai could have sent her out of the camp, out of the family. When, instead of just mistreating her, she could have abandoned her and sent her away, which would have been worse than keeping her and, as I said, try to put her in her place.
But
And
she
they
may have
get-
still wanted the baby.
Yeah, but she didn't have the baby as yet. See, but later on, when we get to it, the angel of the Lord will say, you need to go back to your mistress and submit.
So let's read that.
Yeah,
Let's go on and see because at this point, this whole scenario's getting a little bit out of hand. And we got some serious matters happening now as a result of this whole scenario busting out like it has. And I'm sure God's sitting back there watching it all unfold, and he knows where it's gonna end up, and he chooses to get involved at this point, which is interesting. So verse 7, notice it says she fled from her, and then Hagar, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that is beside the road to Shur, and he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? Notice how's he address her?
servant of
Servant.
Sarah.
Yeah, God mentions,
Yeah,
you're the servant
yeah.
of Sarai.
So technically you say, listen, what's happening is your fault, basically your fault.
You're in the wrong.
Yeah,
You can't do what you're doing, he's saying. You are her servant. And as a result, she answers the angel, and he says, go. And whether this is a spectacular appearance of an angel, or whether it's just like a person, we don't really know, it doesn't really tell us. But she says, I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. Is that politically incorrect today? She's being treated harshly, and God's saying, go back and submit to her harshness, really. Because Sarai could still continue on and being harsh to her. And like I said, now that she's run away, does she especially deserve to be treated harshly? It's probably actually for her own good that she's being treated harshly, so she won't do it again. She needs discipline.
Well, the whole thing's a mess, but the one person who suffers the most through this whole thing is Hagar. She's the one who gets it. And it's interesting, God doesn't make any judgment
He doesn't.
about any of them.
Yeah,
It tells you a lot about God.
he has a lot of compassion here, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He doesn't have to save her, but he chooses to save her. And because God has an eternal perspective on everybody and everything, he knows how all these scenarios in history and in time are going to play out. And he wants certain things to happen in a certain way, and he's gonna make sure they happen the way he wants them to happen, because it is, in the long run, good for everybody that things work out according to his plans. And that's partly why he's being compassionate
Well,
to her.
there is a result, like Peter said, there isn't a result, but there is a result. The Ishmaelites became enemies of the Jewish nation for centuries. I mean, a lot of those people ended up becoming countries that fought with the Jewish nation.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second.
I know, it's part of
Before we get to that. But notice too, he says, go back, and he does make her a promise that he'll increase her descendants, and they'll become too numerous to count. So he's making her a promise too. Very similar to the promise he made to Abram and Sarai, which is very interesting that he's making her that kind of promise, considering what she has just done here. So there's something about all this.
Yeah, then the other thing is that Hagar running away puts her in a much more dangerous position than staying with Abraham.
That is very true. Could she have been abused,
Yeah, she-
running around by
many things like
herself?
that.
She's on her own, yeah.
Back in those days, that was not a good place to be. I'm not sure it's a good place even in our day, to be running around like that too, you know, with being pregnant and being by yourself like that. So God in many ways is very much protecting her. You can even look at it this way, which would you rather do? Go back and be treated harshly, or live on the streets begging for scraps, hoping somebody doesn't abuse you? And they probably would have. She's better off going back in this, even if it was a bad situation with Sarai than when she was contemplating doing so. She wasn't being rational in her thinking now. She was being very emotional. She's angry probably. She's spiteful. She doesn't like the way all this has worked out, but she's gotta get past it. And God's trying to help her do that.
And also, you know, we talked about the promise made to her that her offspring would be numberless. Technically, it's still a part of that promise to Abraham. His offspring would be numberless. Ishmael is his offspring. So
Yeah, he even names the child too.
So
God even
both-
takes the point to name her child for her.
yeah, so both his offspring become people who are numberless, just the same. So it's technically the same promise to Abraham.
Yeah. This is part of God's ordering of the history of the world in allowing this situation to continue. And then, and as Wayne brought up here too, let's read verse 12. It says, he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He will live in hostility towards all his brothers. Now, there's a lot of things that have been written about this particular passage. And I noticed in a lot of commentaries, you can see some people really blasting Ishmael and his lineage. Other ones are trying to be sympathetic and say it's not really that bad. What does the phrase wild donkey of a man mean? Or what do you think it
Let's
means?
just say wild donkey.
What is a wild donkey? I mean, they had them back in those days. How did a wild donkey live?
Roamed around.
Yeah, they just roamed around. They had no master. They did whatever they wanted. Very often, that's just the way they were. And they were, a donkey is known to be stubborn. Very much so. That's part of the history of the animal too. Certain animals are like that. They're difficult to sometimes domesticate. Not always, but sometimes. Notice it says his hand will be against everyone. Everyone's hand will be against him. He'll live in hostility even towards his own brothers. So, what's Ishmael's personality?
Antagonistic,
He's a wanderer on the earth, and it turns out he was.
antagonistic to everyone.
Yeah, he was an archer, he hunted on his own, he was out in the wilderness on his own. Eventually, he does in time, get married, but we'll talk about that in the next chapter too, where we talk a little bit more about his lineage and where it comes from. But, some people say this is what's going on. Most of the Arabs and Muslim nations consider Ishmael their father through Abraham, and they claim Abraham also as their father, as the Jews do. So both nationalities claim Abraham through their lineage. Ishmael is for the Arabs and the Muslim nations, and Isaac was through the Jewish nations. So they both claim the same father, but they have different personalities, and they live very much differently in many different ways. So some people explain that this is why there's still conflict going on in the Middle East now. And I suspect that might be true. I don't wanna be overly harsh about it, but, it doesn't appear to be totally out the realm that that's what exactly is going on over there. So, and not everybody's like that, just because somebody's, of a certain descent doesn't mean everybody's like that. But there are some tendencies sometimes in certain populations to have certain issues that they wrestle with in certain ways. So, and I'm sure there's quite many Arabs today that are Christians. We don't wanna condemn everybody, but there are some tendencies, that history bore out, that this was true. There's just been a lot of conflict in that part of the world, and it seems to be never ending. And it just doesn't seem like there's ever a resolution, that's permanent over there. There's just constant arguing and fighting over all kinds of stuff over there. Any questions or thoughts about Ishmael in this particular aspect?
Going along with that, I can't help but think that one, that lie about this not being my wife, one little lie, look what it led to. I mean, we're still dealing with it today. I mean, we've never seen that happen before. One little eating the wrong apple was what the result was. The wrong fruit. It's funny how God things can take care of themselves. God's a just God. If there's a wrong, it will eventually bear fruit.
All right, so, verse, 13, so she gave this name, to the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Beer Lamai Ro. It is still there between Kadesh and Berdid. So Hagar bore Abraham a son, and Abraham gave him the name Ishmael, to the son she bore. And Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So, just so you know too, that, he's 86, at this particular time. Sarai is 10 years younger than Abram. So she's 76 at this particular point in history. So, a lot of years have passed since then. Between chapter 12, I want to make mention too that this covenant, the next chapter 17, deals in called the covenant of circumcision. And this covenant issue keeps coming up in the life of Abraham, because remember when the Tower of Babel issue came up, it was becoming obvious that there's a lot of people in the world that were still evil, just like before the flood. And God comes up with this scenario that he's going to have another nation that's going to lead in righteousness. And he begins this nation with one man, and that one man is Abraham. And he's going to become a nation that is going to be filled with people who worship God and continue on, so God can build a godly nation out of these people and give people a chance to worship him. So he makes this covenant promise to Abraham back in chapter 12. And remember, we talked about it back then. He made 7 promises to Abraham. And that was his promise and his covenant that he's going to make. So we can see that. And then he was 75 years old when he made that original promise back then. And then as time went on in chapter 15, time goes on a little bit further, and he's in his 80s then. And then he promises in that particular chapter a whole list of things where he talks about he's going to have a son, he's going to inherit the land of Canaan, and he even tells them the history of his people up to 400 years into the future when the Israelites end up in Egypt. And he talks about basically about Pharaoh, and he's really referring to Moses. He also talks about the fact too that he's going to have a seed, which Abram probably had no idea what the seed meant, because that was a future reference to the Messiah. When we mentioned that in Galatians chapter 3, verse 15, the seed was Jesus. And I doubt Abraham understood that at the time. Now we're in chapter 17, and Abram now is now 99 years old. So time keeps marching on, all these covenants, all these promises, and still nothing's happened yet to this point. So it's a long time in coming for all these promises that he's dealing with here. So, chapter 17, verse 1. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will confirm my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. So he gives his age and he asks, part of the covenant, he says, I want you to be what? What does he say to Abraham? Blameless. Can any human being be blameless?
Only one.
Remember, Jesus even said in Matthew 5, verse 48, be perfect as I am perfect. The Lord God is referring to. So God's telling Abram to be perfect, and Jesus is telling Christians to be perfect. What is he saying? Now, a lot of people have said, well, that word perfect means mature. But you can't say that, because he's comparing it to God. Is God mature, or is he perfect? He's perfect. So that gets into a whole other scenario. When we talk about the sufficiency of Christ's salvation. It does make us perfect. And that goes clear back to Abram too, because God's promise through the Messiah extends to all ages of the past also.
Yeah, the Christian life isn't difficult, it's impossible. And this is
Yes.
coming in here. You just have to stick to God.
Yeah.
Here's what he's saying.
So, we're gonna stop here because we're out of time now. But, there's a whole bunch more promises and stipulations in chapter 17. And this will be the end of explaining the covenant 3 different times to Abram. Because it took a long time to fully have this whole process worked out. And we'll talk about it next week as far as what all these things mean. There's some new things that are gonna come up that weren't in some of the earlier statements that God had made to Abram. So it's an evolving covenant with different things coming in at different points. But this will be the final scenario that comes forth here. All right, any final questions or thoughts?
Yes, as here, God says to Abraham, walk before me and be blameless. When Paul talks about it in Romans, Paul says, justified. Our blamelessness or justification cannot be on us. God is the one who makes us just as if I had never sinned. So that blamelessness and that being justified is God doing that for us.
And that's an extremely important principle that you mentioned it. Peter also mentioned it too. When people try to define that word perfection or blameless and say it means mature, that is incorrect. You're missing a very important point by saying that. Because it makes it sound like you aren't really perfect, but you do. You